Will Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement survive? Closing arguments have concluded in the largest national security trial since Beijing imposed its controversial law. 47 leading pro-democracy activists are awaiting a verdict, but the final judgment silenced critics of the one-party system once and for all. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Hong Kong. Accused of subverting the government, it's already been almost 3 years since they were first arrested. Many of these so-called Hong Kong 47 were denied bail, and if found guilty, they could face life in prison. Their fate is also being decided by government-appointed judges, not a jury of their peers. So it's a trial that pro-democracy activists say proves Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, a right that was guaranteed for 50 years during the Hong Kong handover in 1997. But Beijing advocates say this is about national security and stability, and the trial adheres to the rule of law. Let's look now at how it began and what's at stake.
Closing arguments in the landmark case of Hong Kong's democracy activists have ended. In 2021, the police rounded up over 50 pro-democracy campaigners and politicians for holding unofficial primary election polls. Authorities later charged 47 of them with conspiracy to subvert state power under the China-imposed national security law. 16 who denied the charges have now entered the final stretch of their trial. If found guilty, they face a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. 31 others pleaded guilty and will be sentenced after the trial is complete.
Nowadays, physical violence would not be necessary. Communication with the public is much easier. It's easy to manipulate those means in order to endanger national security.
This all began in 2019, when a proposed bill to allow extradition to China sparked mass protests against Beijing's tightening grip over the city. Violent police crackdowns and possible pro-China mob attacks quelled the demonstrations. In 2020, in response to the unrest, China introduced a new national security law that expanded the central government's control over Hong Kong and allowed it to further crush dissent.
The purpose of this piece of legislation is not just to punish, it is also to deter people from committing such serious offenses as secession, subverting the state power, terrorist activities, and so on and so on.
Days after the law came into effect, opposition groups held a symbolic protest vote, also intended to decide on the pro-democracy candidates to challenge the pro-China camp in the upcoming state elections.
With the crackdown from Beijing, now is not the time for us to surrender. Every vote cast and the protest vote would receive and generate more mandate for activists continue to have our international advocacy. We also hope to, through our vote in the primary election, let the Beijing know that we will not kowtow to China.
It was an unofficial vote that was also held for previous elections. But in January 2021, police arrested the politicians and the organizers of the polls. After repeated delays, the trial started in February this year. It was expected to last 90 days, but it has been 10 months already, and most of the defendants remain in custody.
Primary election is not crime. This is political repression. We demand the immediate release of all political prisoners.
The case has become the symbol of Hong Kong's diminishing democracy, but China's suppression of freedom persists. According to China File magazine, 148 people have been charged with national security crimes. 103 of them have pleaded guilty or convicted, while none have been acquitted. Hong Kong's independent media has also been crushed, as authorities have raided news outlets and arrested journalists. And John Lee, who oversaw the crackdown on protesters in 2019, became the city's chief executive last year. This October, he announced Hong Kong will introduce its own national security law in 2024.
We must guard against those seeking to provoke conflict, misinform, or spread rumors through different channels, and remain alert to acts of soft resistance in different forms that can undermine the governance of the country and the Hong Kong SAR.
The court say the activist trial verdict is expected within 3 to 4 months, with many other national security cases dragging on for years. Like those cases, democracy and the rule of law may be dying a slow and agonizing death in Hong Kong.
So what will the pending verdict say about democracy in Hong Kong and the health of the one country, two systems doctrine? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from London, pro-democracy activist Simon Cheng, who's also in exile in the UK, from Beijing, political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen, and from Canterbury, human rights lawyer and former lead prosecutor with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, Sir Geoffrey Nice. Thank you all so much for being with me. Sir Geoffrey, I'll start with you. Just the fact that this trial was supposed to last a few months and it's now dragged on for nearly a year so far, what does that say to you about the quality of the system?
Well, I'm afraid it doesn't really tell me anything because I wasn't there to see it in public. I suppose generally speaking, you would say if a trial takes longer than expected, it may be because there's been more evidence to consider, assuming that is that hearing days were sequential one after the other. It may indicate that there was more to challenge in the evidence that was being given, or it may indicate that there was more law to argue. But that, apart from that, I'm afraid the length of trial tells me nothing. Because, rightly or wrongly, criminal trials in this sort of area do tend to stretch quite a lot.
It's interesting because we've heard the comments of other attorneys that have said the opposite, that it does indicate that the system, they actually don't know how to properly apply these laws, and that is why it's taking longer than it should have, while so many defendants have to kind of languish in jail. But let me ask Simon then, what are your expectations here? Do you think this can be a fair trial?
Well, I think many people, including me, would not expect that highly to the Hong Kong judiciary anymore. Of course, because there has many sides that we could question about their credibility of the fair trial. For example, the judges have been politically appointed and handpicked by the chief executive, and the law actually been made by the rubber stamps in Beijing and circumvent our wills of the people in Hong Kong. And you can also see they have lots of measures that they could prevent such a fair trial, because they could proceed the trial without jury, and that would be a very fierce challenge to our Hong Kong's common laws system and traditions. And there's many ways that we would question about, and of course that we'll expect the judges would rule them as criminals at the end, because there's such a political pressures over the judiciary. So we don't really see that as a purely a case of a legal case, but it's definitely a political persecution.
Einar, let me ask you, specifically also about the point that the judges have been appointed by a pro-Beijing leader, and people say that in itself means this trial will be skewed. Is that the case?
Well, it's awfully loaded, Andrea, to say, well, he's pro-Beijing. Yes, he was appointed by Beijing, but he has to have the confidence of the Hong Kong people. If he's seen as something of just as a puppet, that will not do well. In fact, it will probably do the exact opposite of what Beijing wants. So I think they're bending over backwards to make sure that this trial adheres to the minimum legal requirements that are out there. Remember, this is there's multiple defendants. Most have pled guilty. Only 16 remain. 4 of their compatriots have testified against them. It's just very difficult for them to kind of circumvent the fact that they were involved in, a series of protests that were illegal over a course of a year that basically brought Hong Kong to its knees economically, in particular. So at this point, it's going to take 3 or 4 months for them to render judgment. That means that there's not a rush to it. They're going to be very careful in what they do. If this was the kind of kangaroo court that my other 2 colleagues seem to be hinting it might be, it would have been a very quick trial in secret, and then there would have been a very quick sentencing, and that is not the case at all.
Simon, does that make you feel any better to hear?
Well, absolutely not. I think, honestly, with all due respect, it's nonsense because, the judges have been handpicked under such an environment that the law, have been drafted by those small amounts of people holding a power. And that is not fair to the people. And what the Gap said, that should hold the confidence for the people. And I'm the one of those in exile, and many people, they're fleeing from the country. And I think that we should remember why the people were so upset to the judiciary back in our hometown. And that is definitely, those people, those activists, those
Simon, I mean, quite frankly, you're trying to drag your own experience into this. The fact that you have fled and that you believe something differently, that you believe that Hong Kong should be independent, that is at odds with Beijing's position that Hong Kong is part of China. If you choose to form some sort of, organized rebellion, yes, the state will kick back at you. I mean, now Agnes Chow has joined you in going into exile. It doesn't make you right because you leave the scene of your crime.
Well, first of all, I think there's many people, they just hope they have a fair system back in Hong Kong. And that's we are the people, and the government should listen to the voice of the people. And no one would like to bear the legal risk, but until the government doesn't listen to the voice of the people, I hope that you could understand, even Chinese Communist Party, why they have been set up. And moreover, what you mentioned about the activists or political candidates before, they actually usually have been entitled as a legal power and duty to hold the government to account. And it happens enshrined in the basic law, especially the basic law article 49 to 15.2. They could veto the budget proposed by the government. And they also have been entitled.
People cannot veto the budget of the government, and you well know that, all right? The legislative system that was left in Hong Kong was left by the British, not created by the Chinese. So if you have a bone to pick with them, you should be talking to the people where you are in London about why they only introduced some limited form of democracy just before they left. You seem to be huddling in the very home of the people who denigrated you.
Many years ago. But the colonial legacy, many would argue, has dissipated enough over the time so that it can't really be put to the British.
Well, Andrea, that's not true. I mean, in China, at least, they still remember the 100 years of humiliation, the fact that Britain
But I'm
took
talking about
lands
the
from
laws that are
over
on
drugs.
the books, that they have moved. I remember you citing before laws from, 100 years before that you had blamed, almost to say, see, you want this legacy, you want the British system, then fine, we'll use these antiquated laws from 100 years ago that the British left to show you that this is what the colonial legacy is. But the times have moved on. So but before we go too far, Einar, I might want to come back to that. I need to get Geoffrey into the conversation because, Geoffrey, in your experience, in seeing these sorts of cases, when you've had to try them in international courts in your experience, and you see judges in cases that are appointed by the authorities in power, do you feel the courts can still act independently and that the trials can still be fair? So what is your feeling, in essence, about how this judgment can be seen?
First of all, there was an unfortunate observation that I was saying this was a kangaroo court. There was nothing in what I said in my first contribution that implied any such thing, and perhaps it would better be withdrawn. As to your question,
withdraw that. You did question it, though, without having any knowledge, which is unusual for a lawyer.
To answer the question, or would you rather interrupt me? I don't mind. Just make your mind up. Now then, on the question I was asked, in international courts where judges are appointed by nation states, often, there is always some anxiety about whether they bring with them a degree of prejudice or whether they are, during a trial, susceptible to prejudice or pressure. Not prejudice, they're subject to pressure. The more open the trial system is, the less that sort of concern is realized. But I think it's true to say that all international courts dealing with international crimes have a concern that they may not be fully independent. we just hope that they are. As to this particular court, I haven't watched the trial proceedings and I haven't been there. I'm bound to observe the manifest criticisms made by the Economic and Social Council as early as recently as the 27th of March this year about both China and the conduct of proceedings in Hong Kong. And they make very disturbing reading. But as I explained when I made my first contribution, yes, as has been suggested, it's always possible that a longer trial is serving collateral purposes, keeping people in prison, for example. But what we now need to see, and this is unfortunate if people are being kept in prison unfairly, I make no comment about that, what we need to see is the final decision, a written decision, I hope, with reason and analysis of the evidence. And that's the time to assess whether it's been a fair trial or not.
Einar, sorry, so Geoffrey, because you make an important point in that you say you haven't been attending the trial. Well, the truth is, not a lot of detailed information has come out of this trial. So it's been very difficult for journalists or anyone else to really analyze how the proceedings have been. I mean, Einar, can you accept that that in itself isn't the best indication of a truly fair and transparent proceeding?
It's very difficult.
Well, as a lawyer, I was both in the prosecution side and also as an intern, unfortunately, but also as a defense attorney for 5 years. I can tell you that I prefer an open court. And actually, I like the idea of it being televised. But this isn't up to me. This is up to the local authorities. In the United States, they bar people from, journalists from actually taking any photographs, et cetera. That's true in the Donald Trump case. Every jurisdiction has its own. Now, what I object to, what Sir Geoffrey is doing, he says, I don't know anything about this case, but I've read things said about it. And he said it's very disturbing. He continues to cast doubt on the system while maintaining he doesn't know anything about that. It's highly unusual for an attorney to do that. You generally deal with facts, or if you're in summation, you just try to make up a good story. But, this idea that if I haven't watched it, I don't know anything about it, but, I've heard things that I don't like. I think that's a little bit preposterous, actually.
Yeah, but still, you agreed yourself, Einar. It's not the greatest indication that there is very little transparency in how these proceedings have gone.
That I would agree, yes.
Yeah. Okay, let me come back to Simon, because there was another angle I wanted to look at here. And this has been a problem in part for some of the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, including yourself, is that they are seen by the pro-Beijing contingent to be backed by foreign powers. But still, the pro-democracy activists have asked on occasion for the international community to at least respond somehow. Not intervene, but respond. So do you think now the international community should be responding? I just wanted to bring up as well, it didn't go unnoticed that the U.S. did not help Joshua Wong, who asked to enter the U.S. consulate just before he was sent to jail. But you've noted that there is this bill in the U.S. Congress calling for sanctions on the officials and the judges and the prosecutors involved in this trial. So to what extent is it helpful for the international community to respond, and to what extent does it actually make your case harder?
Well, absolutely. I think that international community, especially the UN human rights system, should speak out even against such a powerful state. I think it's really important because those people, we need to remember, those activists, those political candidates now in prisons, they're actually being psychologically tortured. And we need to be aware they're human beings. And the fear for them is not about the suppression of the authoritarian regime and those people speaking for authoritarian regime, but it's about the fear of being forgotten by the international community. And they might feel their sacrifice may be in vain. And I think it's very important, even the US administration, we could have such freedom to be critical of the US administration not being fair, be put in prison, just like now in Hong Kong, in China. And we hope President Biden and others, senior politicians, they should consider to help those people get let them out of the prison, not interfering into the domestic affairs of China, but based on a humanitarian reason, because we're all human beings. Those people should not be treated like that just because they're critical of the government. And that is really important. They should not be trade off for business interests, for those people's political interests or business interests. No, those grassroots people are our people. We need to rescue them from authoritarian suppression.
Okay, Einar, I see you shaking your head already. I mean, I know you believe there is just no space for any international party to really voice an opinion, much less take action based on.
No, I mean, quite the contrary. Every country is entitled to voice its opinion, but you do so at the risk of inviting opinions about your own actions. I mean, a lot of this goes to this issue that the authorities believe that these activists were in fact backed by foreign powers, particularly the United States. It's not unheard of. I mean, there's declassified documents over many, many years showing that this U.S., in addition to spending about $90 billion a year on spying and disinformation, has surveilled its own people, that it influences others, that it used vaccination programs as covers for spying. And that it was, has actively reestablished some sort of spy network in China, and that's according to Bill Burns himself just this last July. So this idea that somehow these are just wonderful kids who were just trying to prove a point, well, they brought the city down to its knees for a year. You have to cast your mind back to all those pictures of these demonstrators, some of them who were peaceful, others who decided that they needed to trash every business they thought had any kind of mainland connection. That is not peaceful, and that you can't do.
Okay, I'll tell you what, we're down to. Go ahead, quickly, Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to correction. There's nothing wrong with being backed by so-called foreign power, because that's, those people that's been imprisoned unfairly. We need the support of the international community. Don't bring the state and international politics in here to dehumanize our voice of the people. We have our right to speak out against the government and those small amounts of people in power. That's simple question of humanity, not about politics. Don't frame us as traitors, because it's unfair stigma.
Okay.
The government is framing you as traitors.
Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you what, we're down to our last couple minutes now, though, so I'd like to get all three of you to voice your opinion on this question. Sir Geoffrey, is it perhaps time to accept that maybe the one country, two systems doctrine is just not realistic, that one-party rule out of Beijing will not be compatible with a multi-party democracy? In Hong Kong, it was supposed to be held for 50 years, with all the freedoms that were granted from 20 plus years ago, but it's not working out that way. Is it just maybe time to move forward based on the fact that Hong Kong is just now part of mainland China?
It may be realistic in various theaters with which we are now concerned, looking at other conflicts. May be sensible to, may be realistic to say democracy is not going to flourish as we understand it in certain places. But, and I refer to an earlier contribution, my two earlier contributions, I'm only concerned, because that's all I've been asked to be concerned about, with looking at things from the outside and giving such answers as I can. And one comment that is very important to make concerning the failure for this trial to be fully public and for all the evidence to be fully available, or for the propositions about pressure of foreign countries to be the subject of evidence, is an observation made by a committee, initially a committee of 3, that included a Confucian philosopher. It reads as follows: everyone charged with a penal offence has the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to law in a public trial, at which he has all the guarantees necessary for his defence, and that is the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Okay, Simon, let me give you some quick final words.
Well, I really hope that through this program that lets our voice to speak out, because, apparently China and Hong Kong's governments criminalize all dissenting thoughts. And our people now in prison, unfairly putting into the prison, need help. And we hope that the international community will hear about it. And the UN Human Rights Committee already say NSL is not consistent with ICCPR, the human rights conventions around the world. So we usually have the same standards because we all are human beings. We're not only Chinese or Hong Kongers, but we are the human being on this earth.
Okay.
And we should safeguard our human dignity together.
Simon, that will have to be the final word. So unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. And of course, our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.